At 10:14 in the morning on August 24, 1944, Captain Thomas Robert Callahan, 24 years old, 31 combat missions behind him, feels the stick buck in his hand as flame licks backward from beneath the cowling of his P-51D Mustang, 24,000 feet above the smokestacks of Merseburg, Germany. The aircraft is named Buckeye Bell, the words painted in looping yellow script below the cockpit rail, a gift from his crew chief after Mission 19. 2 minutes ago, the Packard V1657 engine beneath that painted name was producing 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. Now it is producing smoke, and smoke is filling the cockpit through the firewall seems faster than the air scoop can clear it. The Merlin's 12 cylinders, its glycol coolant lines, its supercharger spinning at over 25,000 revolutions per minute. One part of that machine has failed, and Callahan does not yet know which one. He knows only that his windscreen has gone the color of a dirty penny, that his eyes are streaming, and that for the first time in 31 missions, he cannot see his own instrument panel. 270 men are why he does not turn for home. 270 men, aboard 27 B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 91st Bomb Group, 10 crewmen to a ship, flying a tight defensive box 4,000 feet below him, inbound to put 500 bombs on the Luna Synthetic Oil Works. 270 men, not statistics, not mission parameters. Men who have already survived 22 missions on average for this group, who have families waiting in Ohio and Nebraska and Georgia, who do not know that the fighter escort assigned to their high squadron is currently on fire. The number will not leave Callahan's head for the next 40 minutes. 270 men, and he is one of only 4 aircraft standing between them and the German fighters already climbing to meet them. The objective is simple to state and brutal to execute. Escort the 91st's lead combat wing to the target and back, denying the Luftwaffe a clean pass at the bomber stream. The threat climbing toward them is Jagdgeschwader 4, flying Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 interceptors at 386 miles an hour in level flight, each carrying 2 13mm machine guns and a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub at a combined rate of better than 1,100 rounds a minute. A single well-executed pass through a bomber formation, unopposed, can put down 3 or 4 fortresses in the time it takes to say the sentence. 3 or 4 fortresses is 30 to 40 men. The math is not abstract. 5 German fighters, unopposed for 90 seconds, can kill more Americans than died on this base in the previous 6 weeks combined. Callahan's flight is 4 Mustangs, call sign Cardinal, out of the 354th Fighter Squadron, 355th Fighter Group, based at Steeple Morden in Cambridgeshire, England, 181 miles behind them now. First Lieutenant Walter Henry Dobbs, 23, of Tulsa, Oklahoma, flies element lead on Callahan's wing, 640 hours in type. 3 confirmed aerial victories already to his name, and a habit of humming the same 4 bars of a Bob Wills tune over the radio before every engagement, so consistently that the rest of the flight has learned to key their mics on when they hear it, because it means Dobbs has spotted something before anyone else. Second Lieutenant Samuel Peter Ruiz, 22, of El Paso, Texas, flies Cardinal 3, 9 confirmed strafing runs on rail targets, no aerial kills yet credited to him, and a stick of chewing gum working constantly behind his oxygen mask, a habit his crew chief swears keeps his jaw from locking under G-force during high-speed dives. First Lieutenant George Albert Whitfield, 25, of Charleston, South Carolina, flies Cardinal 4, the oldest man in the flight, 211 hours of combat time, 2 victories of his own, and a quiet ritual of reciting the opening line of the 23rd Psalm over a dead mic in the 30 seconds before contact. A habit none of the others have ever mentioned aloud, but all of them privately time their own nerves against. Callahan runs the roll call himself at 10:09, 5 minutes before the fire. Cardinal 2. Two's up. Cardinal 3. Three's up, Skipper. Cardinal 4. Four's with you. 4 voices, 4 men, 4 machines, 81 combined missions of experience between them, and in 31 minutes only one of them will still be flying an intact airplane. Wingspan on the Mustang is 37 feet, side by side with the Messerschmitt's 32 feet 2 inches. The German fighter is smaller, lighter, and more agile at low and medium altitude by a margin every pilot in the 8th Air Force has been briefed on since arrival. Top speed favors the Mustang above 20,000 feet, where its two-stage, two-speed Merlin supercharger keeps making rated power the German engine can no longer match. 386 miles an hour for the Bf-109 G6 against 437 for the Mustang at that altitude. A 51-mile-an-hour edge that exists only because of where the fight is happening. Climb rate runs the other way. The 109 gains roughly 300 feet a minute faster than the Mustang below 15,000 feet, though that advantage narrows and eventually reverses above 20,000. Armament splits the difference. Callahan's 6 wing-mounted Browning M2 machine guns fire a combined rate of better than 4,000 rounds a minute in aggregate, more raw volume than the Germans' cannon and machine gun combination. But Voss's 20mm cannon rounds carry roughly 4 times the destructive payload per hit. Neither airplane is simply better. Each is better in specific circumstances, and the fire beneath Callahan's cowling has just taken away the one circumstance, sustained high-altitude power, where his machine held the clear edge. The numbers do not favor the Mustang in a straight comparison. The Bf-109 G6 outclimbs the P-51D by roughly 300 feet per minute below 15,000 feet, and can outturn it in a sustained horizontal fight by a margin every fighter pilot in the theater has learned the hard way. The Messerschmitt weighs 6,800 pounds fully loaded against the Mustang's 9,900. Less mass, tighter radius, faster onset of turn. Where the Mustang wins is range and speed in the dive, and at altitude above 20,000 feet, where its two-stage supercharger keeps making power long after the German engine has begun to gasp for air. At 24,000 feet, in clean air, on 2 working engines, Callahan holds the advantage. The fire has just taken that advantage away from him before the fight has even started, because a burning airplane cannot climb, and an airplane that cannot climb cannot use altitude as a weapon. Outside the canopy, the temperature reads -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his oxygen mask, each breath freezes into a fine rime of ice crystals on the rubber before it can fully clear. Through the smoke-fogged windscreen, he can make out almost nothing beyond the shape of his own left wing, and far below, the contrails of the bomber stream cutting white lines across a landscape the color of gunmetal. His fingers, even gloved, have gone numb past the second knuckle. The gauges glow a dull amber in the haze, airspeed, manifold pressure, oil temperature, all of it half swallowed by smoke he cannot yet identify the source of. He is deaf to anything but engine noise and static, blind to anything past 30 feet, and he has not yet fired a shot. At 10:17, the oil pressure gauge, the one instrument he can still read clearly, drops from 87 pounds per square inch to 61 in the space of 90 seconds. A coolant line, not a fuel line. The fire is fed by ethylene glycol, not gasoline, which buys him minutes he would not otherwise have. But the engine will seize without coolant in 9 to 11 minutes at current temperature readings. 9 minutes is the new deadline layered on top of the old one. 8th Air Force doctrine on an engine fire at altitude, deep in hostile territory, is unambiguous. Extinguish if possible, and if not, brake for friendly lines or bail out over territory where evasion is survivable. Group standing orders put the historical loss rate for pilots who ride a burning single-engine fighter past the 5-minute mark at somewhere near 40%. Factoring structural failure, fuel tank ignition, and loss of control. Every instructor who trained Callahan at Foster Field would tell him to turn west now, put the burning engine behind a shallow dive, and get as many miles toward the North Sea as the airframe will give him before it either extinguishes or kills him. Cardinal 2, 3, and 4 could escort the bombers alone, under strength but present. Except in the next 90 seconds, Dobbs's voice crackles over the radio reporting fuel transfer trouble of his own. His drop tank has failed to feed, cutting his effective range by half, and group control confirms no reserve flight is within 12 minutes of the bomber stream. The nearest help is 90 miles away. Whatever happens in the next half hour happens with the airplanes already in the sky. Callahan's hands are steady on the stick at a heart rate his own flight surgeon would later estimate, from his account, at something over 160 beats a minute. Ruiz's voice comes over the radio tight. "Skipper, you're trailing smoke bad, you need to break off." Callahan keys his mic once. "Negative, those bombers don't have anybody else." He is not breaking off. If you want to see how Captain Callahan pulled off what happens next, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Back to the fight. At 10:19, with the fire not yet extinguished and the coolant gauge still falling, Callahan does something that appears in no flight manual issued to 8th Air Force pilots. He pulls the mixture control back to idle cutoff for a 4 count. Deliberately starving the burning engine of fuel-air mixture to smother the flame at its source, accepting a controlled, momentary loss of power at 24,000 feet in exchange for a chance at killing the fire. For 4 full seconds, the Mustang becomes a 12,000-pound glider with a windmilling propeller, airspeed bleeding from 310 miles an hour toward 260, altitude dropping at better than 2,000 feet a minute. Ruiz's voice again, sharper. "Skipper, what are you doing? You'll flame it out for good." Callahan does not answer. He is watching the fire. At the 4-second mark, he shoves the mixture back to auto-rich and feels the engine catch, cough, and grab hold again. The flame guttering from a solid orange sheet down to a thin ribbon trailing off the exhaust stacks, starved. Not extinguished, but reduced by an order of magnitude. It is a maneuver that trades one risk, structural fire, for another, an unrecoverable flameout at altitude with no engine restart guaranteed above 20,000 feet in 31 degrees below zero air. It should not have worked. It bought him time it should not have bought. The idle cutoff maneuver is not written in any flight manual issued to 8th Air Force pilots, and for good reason. Starving a Merlin engine at war emergency power carries a real risk of a flameout that cannot be restarted above 18,000 feet, where the thin, frigid air makes a windmill restart unreliable at best. Ruiz's protest over the radio reflects exactly that risk, not panic. He has read the same technical orders Callahan has, and by the book, Callahan has just traded a slow, containable fire for a fast, possibly permanent loss of power. What the book does not account for is that a controlled 4-second interruption, at this specific airspeed and this specific altitude, starves the fire of atomized fuel faster than it starves the cylinders of the air they need to keep firing on momentum alone. A narrow window Callahan is gambling exists and has never personally tested. It works. It should not have. Dobbs, still fighting his own fuel transfer failure, slides his Mustang directly beneath Callahan's burning wing, matching speed within 5 miles an hour, close enough that Callahan can see him mouth something behind his mask. A visual escort, flying wing on a man who is technically supposed to be flying wing on him, so that if the fire flares again, Dobbs can call it before Callahan smells it. Ruiz pulls out ahead to cover the 12 o'clock approach to the bomber box. 6,000 pounds of fuel now his sole concern, as he burns it faster at low altitude to hold position. Angling his Mustang to give the lead squadron's tail gunners a clean line of sight past his own wingtips. Whitfield drops back to trail, watching their six, reciting his line under his breath one time through though contact has not yet come, his eyes moving in the same disciplined scan pattern, high, low, 6 o'clock, repeat, that 81 combined missions of experience have carved into muscle memory. None of it is discussed over the radio. Each man simply does the job the moment requires, the way 4 pilots who have flown together for 11 months do without needing to be told. The numbers, reported now, are these. Buckeye Bell carries 144 gallons of usable fuel remaining out of an original 180, and 1,140 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition remaining out of an original 1,880, split across 6 wing-mounted Browning machine guns. At current burn rate, 144 gallons is roughly 38 minutes of flight time. The nearest safe airfield, an emergency strip on the Belgian side of the front, is 61 minutes away at cruise power. The gap between what the tanks hold and what the trip home requires is already 23 minutes wide, and the fight has not started. At 10:22, First Lieutenant Erich Voss of Jagdschwader foresights the American bomber box from 8,000 feet above and slightly behind, at his 10 o'clock, closing from the northwest at an indicated 410 miles an hour in a shallow dive. Voss is 26, a veteran of 18 months on the Eastern Front before his transfer to Reich Air Defense in the spring of 1944, credited with 14 prior victories, flying at the head of a swarm of 4 Messerschmitts scrambled from an airfield 41 miles east of Leipzig 18 minutes earlier. He does not see the burning Mustang yet. He sees bombers, and bombers are the mission, his orders, like every Reich Defense pilot's orders that summer, prioritize the 4-engine aircraft over their escorts, because the bombers are what is destroying the oil refineries his own fighters depend on for fuel. He closes to within 4,000 yards before Whitfield calls the tally. Bandits, 12 high, 4 ships, closing fast. The 4 Cardinal fighters turn to meet them, putting themselves between the Messerschmitts and the lead squadron of B-17s, whose own top turret and tail gunners begin tracking the German formation without yet firing, waiting for a range the escorts have not yet given up. For 11 seconds neither side fires, both formations closing at a combined rate of nearly 800 miles an hour. Then Voss's swarm splits into 2 pairs and dives, one pair angling for the bomber box directly, the other, Voss's own, breaking toward the Mustangs first. The reversal comes almost immediately. Voss's wingman spots the thin ribbon of smoke still trailing from Callahan's engine, visible from over a mile away against the pale sky, and calls it over the radio in clipped German. A damaged fighter, an easy kill, worth breaking formation for. It is Callahan's own fire that marks him as the priority target. The very failure that should have sent him home instead makes him the first Mustang the Germans commit to killing. Voss peels off from the bomber approach and banks hard toward Buckeye Bell, following sound doctrine perfectly. Kill the wounded escort first, then the bombers are undefended. He is not gloating. He is executing a textbook maneuver against a target his own eyes told him was already finished. Dobbs sees Voss commit and calls the break. Callahan hauls the stick left and pulls 4Gs into a diving turn that puts the burning engine, briefly, directly into the slipstream, enough to flare the fire back to a visible orange tongue for 2 full seconds before it dies down again. Voss overshoots the turn by 300 yards, a clean miss, tracers passing close enough that Callahan hears them crack past the canopy like whip cracks, but he does not score. Dobbs does. Sliding in behind Voss's wingman during the overshoot, Dobbs fires a 2-second burst, roughly 70 rounds, tracking the German fighter through a 45-degree deflection shot that catches the Messerschmitt's engine cowling and sends a sheet of black smoke rolling backward off the cylinder banks. The German fighter rolls inverted and dives away, trailing smoke of its own, not confirmed destroyed but out of the fight. 1 down. 4 remaining German fighters in the area, though only 3 now in the immediate engagement. Fuel reads 126 gallons. The cost lands seconds later. Ruiz, holding his position ahead of the bomber box, takes a burst of 13mm fire across his left wing route from a Messerschmitt neither he nor Whitfield had time to call, the second pair of Vosses swarm having split wide and come up from underneath the American formation, where no one was watching. The rounds shear through 11% of his aileron travel and puncture a fuel line forward of the main tank. His Mustang snap rolls twice before he recovers level flight, streaming fuel in a fine mist behind him that catches the sunlight and briefly makes his aircraft look, from a distance, like it is trailing a length of silver ribbon. His radio calls, "I'm hit, I'm hit," still flying in a voice higher than his usual register, the chewing gum habit abandoned entirely in the 2 seconds it takes him to regain level flight. He is alive. The airplane is wounded, reduced roll authority, a fuel leak bleeding an estimated 4 gallons a minute that will cost him whatever margin he had for the flight home, and a left aileron that responds sluggishly enough that a hard bank in either direction now takes visibly longer than it did 10 minutes earlier. No one dies in this exchange. But the arithmetic of the mission has just gotten measurably worse, and Whitfield breaks formation without being ordered to, sliding in on Ruiz's damaged wing to fly cover while Ruiz fights to hold altitude. Fuel across the flight reported honestly. Callahan at 118 gallons, Dobbs at 91, Ruiz falling fast due to the leak, Whitfield at 134. Ammunition, Callahan down to 990 rounds. The deadline for reaching friendly territory has compressed from 61 minutes to something closer to 40, and every rational calculation available to Callahan says the flight should now disengage, escort what remains of its integrity home, and accept that the bombers will finish the run with reduced cover. The mathematics are brutal, and they say he is dead if he stays. At 10:27, the 3 remaining Messerschmitts regroup for a coordinated pass, one high at 11 o'clock, one low at 5 o'clock, one level at Callahan's 3 o'clock, a classic pincer that leaves no direction of turn without exposing his tail to at least one gun. Voss calls the coordination himself, his voice audible over the intercepted frequency as a string of short, calm instructions, spacing his fighters at roughly 2,000-foot intervals, so that no single evasive maneuver Callahan attempts can escape more than one attacker's cone of fire at a time. It is, by any measure, well-flown, disciplined intercept doctrine, the product of a pilot who has survived long enough on 2 fronts to know exactly how frightened men in damaged aircraft tend to react, and to plan around it. Callahan has perhaps 8 seconds before all three fighters have a firing solution simultaneously, and no textbook maneuver that gets him out of the box without giving at least one German pilot a clean shot. Whitfield's voice comes over the radio, and what he says is correct. "Skipper, we should break for the deck. We can't hold this position much longer." He is not wrong. The honest math says 3 Mustangs, one leaking fuel and one trailing smoke, cannot indefinitely hold off 3 Messerschmitts flown by pilots this competent. Callahan runs the numbers anyway. What it means if they break now. What happens to 270 men in 27 unescorted fortresses over the next 11 minutes to target and 11 minutes back out? He thinks, in the space of 2 seconds, of the ball turret gunner from Ohio who mailed his wife a photograph of their newborn son 3 days before this mission, of the radio operator from Brooklyn who has not stopped talking about his mother's Sunday gravy since the briefing tent, of the co-pilot from Montana who flies with his wife's handkerchief folded inside his flight jacket, not because they are fearless, but because they are terrified and do it anyway. Not because they want glory, but because they cannot live with themselves if they quit. Not because they are superhuman, but because they are deeply, perfectly human. "Hold formation," Callahan answers. "We finish this." At 10:29 he does the thing the title of this story promises. Diving to meet Voss's high attacker head-on, Callahan waits until the range closes to 400 yards. Well inside the distance any instructor would call suicidal for a head-on pass against a cannon-armed fighter. And then, instead of breaking off, chops his throttle and drops full flaps for 1.5 seconds, a maneuver that violates the basic aerodynamic principle every fighter pilot is taught: never bleed energy in front of a closing enemy. His airspeed collapses from 281 miles an hour to 194 in under 2 seconds, the Mustang shuddering on the edge of a stall, its nose pitching up hard enough to press 4.5 Gs into Callahan's seat. The German pilot, committed to his firing pass at the higher closure rate, overshoots directly through the space Callahan's aircraft should have occupied, close enough that Callahan sees rivets on the Messerschmitt's belly. In the half-second the German fighter fills his gun sight from below, Callahan fires a burst of 90 rounds. The Messerschmitt's engine erupts and the fighter rolls inverted into an unrecoverable spin. 2 down. The final German pilot is Voss himself, and he has learned everything his 2 wingmen died proving. He does not attempt a head-on pass. He climbs, patient, watching, and comes at Callahan from directly above and slightly behind. The one angle a Mustang with a smoke-streaked windscreen, and a pilot whose neck is nearly frozen solid inside his collar cannot easily counter. Dobbs sees it half a second too late to call it clean, and instead simply fires, forcing his own guns past their rated convergence angle in a desperate deflection shot at extreme range. A shot that should not connect, and against every reasonable expectation, clips Voss's left wingtip, just enough to spoil his aim by 4 or 5 degrees. Voss's cannon rounds pass 8 feet wide of Callahan's cockpit instead of through it. Callahan rolls hard right and comes up beneath Voss's exposed belly, firing his last sustained burst, 140 rounds, nearly emptying 2 of his 6 guns, into the Messerschmitt's oil cooler and wing root. Voss's fighter begins trailing heavy black smoke and turns east, diving away from the fight, not confirmed destroyed but broken off and descending under control. 3 down, 1 damaged and fleeing, and somewhere inside that cockpit is a 26-year-old man who has flown 14 previous engagements and survived, someone's son, someone's brother, doing a duty he did not choose to end this way. War does not allow time for that grief. Not yet. The silence that follows is almost worse than the noise. No more engines closing, no more tracers. Then the accounting. Callahan's fuel reads 41 gallons. Altitude 19,000 feet descending. Distance to the nearest friendly field in Belgium, 74 miles. At his current rate of fuel consumption and rate of descent, the arithmetic says he will come up 9 to 11 miles short of the runway, somewhere over territory he cannot be certain is friendly. The engine finally seizes at 10:41, coolant exhausted, the Merlin's 12 cylinders locking solid with a shudder. Callahan feels through the airframe more than hears. The propeller freezing in place for a half-second before wind resistance forces it back into a slow, useless windmill. Buckeye Bell becomes, in the space of 1 second, a 3,200-pound glider descending at 1,100 feet a minute, with no way to arrest the rate short of finding lift. He has no reason to expect over open farmland. Altitude 9,000 feet. Distance to the field 31 miles. Airspeed 160, bleeding steadily as he trades speed for lift he cannot otherwise generate. He trims for best glide, holds the nose level against every instinct to fight for altitude he no longer has, and watches the ground rise to meet him with a patience that feels obscene given everything that has happened in the last 27 minutes. 6,000 feet, 19 miles. The propeller windmills uselessly, a dead man's fan against the wind, the only sound now the rush of air over the canopy and the faint creak of an airframe never designed to glide this long. 3,000 feet, 6 miles, a stretch of open farmland visible through the smoke-streaked windscreen where a road runs flat and straight enough to serve as a runway, bounded by hedgerows on both sides that will have to be threaded rather than cleared with any margin. Landing gear will not extend, no hydraulic pressure left in the system to drop it, no time remaining to hand crank it down manually even if he tried. He will land on the belly, 1,200 feet, airspeed 105. He crosses a hedgerow at 80 feet with the stall horn screaming in his ears, holds the nose up against the temptation to dive for the last of his airspeed, and lets the Mustang settle onto the road at an indicated 91 miles an hour. The belly of the aircraft strikes the packed dirt road with a sound Callahan would later describe as the loudest silence of his life. No fire, no explosion, just 340 feet of tearing metal, sparks arcing off the propeller blades, the airframe slewing 30 degrees off centerline before it finally drags to a stop in a shallow ditch. For 4 full seconds nothing moves. No fire, no explosion, just the knowledge that he survived. Belgian resistance fighters reached the crash site within 22 minutes, having watched the descent from a farmhouse 2 miles distant. Callahan was extracted with 2 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder from the impact, and frostbite across both hands severe enough to require 3 weeks of treatment before he could grip a control stick again. Dobbs and Whitfield landed their damaged Mustangs at the emergency strip in Belgium, with a combined 11 gallons of fuel between them. Ruiz, flying on a shredded aileron and a fuel-starved engine, put his aircraft down 19 miles short of the same field in a farmer's pasture, walking away with a broken wrist and a concussion. A senior intelligence officer at the debriefing initially logged the 4-kill claim as inflated, standard procedure for any single engagement, claiming that many victories from one flight, until gun camera footage from Dobbs's aircraft and independent radio intercepts of the German formation's own loss reports corroborated 3 destroyed and 1 damaged German fighter, all attributable to Cardinal flight. Callahan received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the engagement, along with a promotion to major within 4 months. Dobbs, Ruiz, and Whitfield each received the Air Medal with an oak leaf cluster for their roles in the fight. The 91st Bomb Group citation for the mission noted, in language far less colorful than any of this, That fighter escort had prevented what group intelligence estimated could have been the loss of 4 to 6 bombers on the Merseburg run. What matters more than any medal is simpler. The people they were protecting got home without losses that day. Thomas Callahan returned to Dayton, Ohio, after the war and spent 31 years as an aircraft mechanic and eventually a shop foreman at a regional airfield outside the city, specializing, his coworkers would say, half joking, though they meant it, in engines other mechanics had already given up on and marked for replacement. He married a schoolteacher named Dorothy in the spring of 1946, raised 3 children in a house 11 miles from where he'd grown up, coached a little league team for 9 seasons, and rarely discussed the war except in the broadest terms, telling his children only that he'd flown Mustangs and that he'd been lucky. Walter Dobbs went home to Tulsa and became a flight instructor at a small civilian airfield, logging over 11,000 hours over 4 decades, teaching young pilots the same engine-out procedures and emergency judgment that had no official name in any manual on the day he first watched them work. He never married, but was, by every account from his students, one of the most patient and exacting instructors any of them ever had. Samuel Ruiz returned to El Paso, worked construction for 6 years, and then moved into ironwork on high steel, framing 3 of the tallest buildings raised in that city during the 1950s, and told his children once, only once, that heights never frightened him after 1944, because he had already learned what real fear felt like at 24,000 feet with a shredded aileron. George Whitfield went home to Charleston, finished seminary on the GI Bill, and spent 36 years as a Baptist minister to a small congregation, keeping a single photograph from the war tucked inside the cover of his Bible for the rest of his life, though he almost never showed it to anyone who asked what it was. The ball turret gunner's son from Ohio grew up and became a schoolteacher himself, never fully knowing, until a historian tracked down his father's old letters decades later, how close he had come to growing up without a father at all. The radio operator from Brooklyn finally sat his mother down in 1958 and had her teach him the Sunday gravy recipe himself, before her hands grew too unsteady to hold the wooden spoon, and made it every Sunday for his own family for the next 40 years. The co-pilot from Montana returned the handkerchief to his wife in person on the porch of their home outside Missoula in the fall of 1945, folded and clean, and neither of them said much about where it had been for the 11 months he'd carried it. The 4 men of Cardinal Flight held reunions 11 times over the following 4 decades, gathering in Tulsa, in Dayton, in Charleston, in El Paso, taking turns hosting, wives and eventually grandchildren filling out the guest lists as the years went on. By every account from their families, they discussed nearly everything at those gatherings: squadron gossip, other missions, the men they'd lost on other days, the state of the Tulsa Flying Club, Ruiz's latest building project, except the specifics of August 24, 1944. When the subject came up at all, one of them would change it within a sentence or two, and the others would let him. It stayed private among them, honored through silence rather than words, the way certain things are among men who were there and don't need to be reminded. Thomas Callahan died in 1989 at the age of 69. Walter Dobbs died in 1994 at 73. Samuel Ruiz died in 2001 at 79. George Whitfield outlived them all, passing in 2009 at 89, the last man from Cardinal Flight to go. None of their obituaries mentioned the 4 German fighters, the burning engine, or the 270 men aboard 27 Fortresses. They mentioned, in each case, simply that the man had served his country honorably in the Army Air Forces during the war, a line no different from thousands of others printed in thousands of other small-town newspapers that same decade. It was only years later, through the combined efforts of aviation historians cross-referencing 355th Fighter Group Squadron records, surviving gun camera footage held in archival storage, and German lost logs from Jagdgeschwader 4 released for research use in the 1990s, that researchers were able to piece together the full shape of what happened over Merseburg that morning. Matching 4 American combat reports against German maintenance and casualty records that had sat unread in the same file for nearly 50 years. One photograph survives from the week before the mission, 4 young men in flight gear, standing in front of Buckeye Bell's nose art, squinting into a low sun, grinning at whoever held the camera, with no idea what waited for them 1 week later. It hangs today in a small aviation museum in Ohio, one frame among hundreds, and most visitors who pass it never learn the story behind the 4 faces in the photograph. But we see it, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells more people this story exists, and helps pull stories like this one out of dusty archives and back into daylight where they belong. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we bring you forgotten stories of real heroism like this one every single day. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, wherever you are. We want to know. You're not just a viewer of this channel. You're part of what keeps these memories alive. Thank you for making sure Thomas Callahan, Walter Dobbs, Samuel Ruiz, and George Whitfield don't disappear into silence. On the morning of August 24, 1944, with his own engine on fire, Captain Thomas Callahan shot down 3 German fighters, forced off a 4th, and brought his burning Mustang home on his belly rather than abandon 270 men he had never met and would never meet. He and the 3 pilots who flew with him went home to Ohio, Oklahoma, Texas, and South Carolina, and lived long, quiet lives that carried the weight of that morning in ways most of the people around them never knew. And now, through this story, their achievement lives on. These men deserve to be remembered. You're helping make that happen.